Hello, my dear audience, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. I am so happy that you are here with me, and welcome to the premiere of Season 5. I mean, can you believe it? We have been doing this for over 4 years, and now beginning Season 5, it's amazing. So, thank you for the support. And if this is the first time you're listening to Let's Talk Micro, well, thank you for choosing it as one of your podcasts. Okay, so this is a series of episodes that are brought to you by bioMérieux, a global innovator in infectious disease diagnostics. And the goal of these episodes is to shine a light on diagnostic stewardship. And they will be released like every 4 to 6 weeks, and I will let you know when that happens. And this episode is about AST or antimicrobial susceptibility testing. And in it, I am joined by Dr. Andrea Prinzi. And in the episode, she goes over the history of AST, regulatory hurdles, breakpoints, and more. Let's go ahead and listen to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Micro, which is sponsored by bioMérieux. In today's episode, we're diving into the world of antimicrobial susceptibility testing, or AST. We'll start with a quick overview of what AST is and how it's evolved, including the history of automated systems and how they work, especially software tools like the Advanced Expert System, for example, or AES. We'll also talk about breakpoints, why they matter, and the challenges that come with keeping automated systems up to date. Plus, we'll touch on the 21st Century Cures Act and how it's impacted breakpoint updates. And of course, we'll look ahead to where we need to go, what needs to change, and how the field can move forward. So with me, this is the first episode on a series of four, and I'm very excited. And of course, I'm very excited to with the guest that I have. Of course, you know her from the AMR sub series. With me, I have Andrea Prinzi. Andrea, welcome to Let's Talk Micro again.
Hi, Louise. As always, thank you so much for having me.
As always, a pleasure. So, like we like to do, maybe we have some listeners that are tuning in for the first time, and before they go back to the other episodes, maybe you can start with a quick introduction.
I'd be happy to. I'll make it really quick. People might be tired of hearing this from me by now, but I'm Andrea Prinzi. I'm a clinical microbiologist for the first large portion of my life. I was in the laboratory for about 13 years. I have additional training in public health, epidemiology, and a PhD in clinical and translational science. And so I kind of span clin micro, clinical research, infectious diseases, all sorts of things, have an interest in all those areas. And I currently work for bioMérieux. I am right now a field medical director for U.S. Medical Affairs.
Perfect. So, as you know, and as you know, that we always like to start, breaking things down and starting very on the simple side of things. Let's say so everyone can get an understanding, especially those that are just maybe starting in this profession. So, we hear terms like AST, antimicrobial susceptibility testing. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that and why it's so critical in infectious diseases management.
Yeah, for sure. I will start by saying that what I probably should have added to my introduction is that I spend a lot of time thinking about AMR, antimicrobial resistance, and antimicrobial susceptibility testing. This was really the focus of my work for many, many years. And in this process, I've gotten very involved in trying to understand the regulatory hurdles around AST and all of the things we are faced with in terms of challenges, et cetera, related to that. So that is why I'm happy to talk about this today. But just to start, susceptibility testing, I would say, is the cornerstone of the clinical microbiology laboratory. I think it's one of the most important things we as medical laboratory scientists can do in the lab. This is the testing that's performed that helps clinicians understand which antibiotic might be the best choice to treat their patient's infection. It also might help guide dosing or maybe duration of therapy, things like that. So it's really, really important because obviously, if you're giving someone a drug that isn't going to treat the infection, then they're not going to get better. And that treatment selection is really guided by susceptibility testing results. So it's very, very important.
Yeah, it's very important indeed. And as we like to do here, we kind of like our history, right? And we like to bring some background into things. And we definitely know and depending on the audience, you have been in this field many years, but there are some different methods that we have, we use for AST. And some of those have changed over time. So maybe you can, tell us a little bit about the history of AST and how automated systems, they have evolved over time.
Yeah, the history of AST is really interesting. I'm not going to go into the whole story of Alexander Fleming, but I think folks are pretty familiar with that. And I know we talked about that, I think, in one of our very early AMR subseries podcasts about just AMR in general and the history of all that. I will say that susceptibility testing's never really been easy, but it's gone from a little more simple to really, really complex. Interpreting AST results has always been complex, but the methodology has gone from pretty simple to more complex. You started with back in the day, building off of Fleming's work. There were a couple methods going on. The first was broth macrodilution, which is where you've got different concentrations of antibiotic inside of a liquid broth, and you could visually see if organisms were growing in the presence of that concentration or not. Then there was disk diffusion and variations of diffusion methods throughout the 40s. So, where you've got some sort of paper, either disc or strip, that's got a concentration of antibiotic in it, and it gets put on agar and diffuses into the agar. That could tell you something about how much antibiotics needed to potentially kill an organism or stunt its growth. And then what you're seeing in the more modern era is you've taken that broth macrodilution and condensed it down into what we call broth microdilution. This was taken a step further, and broth microdilution was integrated into automated susceptibility systems, which I think most people are probably familiar with now, where you've got high throughput, you can load lots of panels or cards onto a system at one time, and it can do all the testing there. And what we're really starting to see now in the very modern era is a variety of techniques to get phenotypic susceptibility information. So things like um, in situ hybridization or FISH, fluorescent in situ hybridization. You've got like sequencing paired with machine learning. You've got the use of volatile organic compounds, MALDI-TOF. So all these different ways to get phenotypic susceptibility test results faster using all different types of methodologies. So there's a lot of things to choose from and a lot of different reasons why you might pick one of those over the other.
Yeah, no, and it's very cool and interesting, how it has changed over the years, and you can see, I always like to share my experiences, right? And from where I work, like I do this diffusion, I do gradient strips. Then I've seen the broth microdilution. Now you hear, which was a like a big theme and microbe this year, that about like the rapid AST testing, 6 to 8 hours. So it's amazing how much the change. It's such a cool concept to wrap your brain around. But there's still some of those methods. They're still very used. Like I said, I use this diffusion more like a backup, but I still know that some places they still use it a lot more. And I remember having an episode where I interviewed someone in their hospital that was their main method. So it's just this diffusion. So a lot of these, they're still, used maybe as a primary method or as a backup in some cases. Okay, so right, so going back to, so I mentioned the advanced expert system, this type of software, and honestly, for me, my experience, and where I work, I do work with the VITEK 2. That's the instrument that I'm familiar with. And I know about the AES, but the way that things are structured, I don't get much exposure to it. And I know that a lot of people in the audience might not be that familiar with it. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, that software and how does it support clinical decision making.
Sure. I think one thing that we don't talk about quite as often when we talk about susceptibility testing is the software that gets paired with the automated systems. And in a lot of cases, the software may be the most important component, depending on how the lab operates and workflows or what have you. Um, at baseline, a lot of the software that comes with these automated systems is functioning as sort of this if then logic. We call it Boolean logic, where it's running in the background and it's firing off rules. And so rules can be based on um, Clinical Laboratory and Standards Institute or CLSI recommendations for breakpoints or what you should report or not report on certain organisms. It can be limitations from the package insert for that product. Those things can be built into the software, and then they automatically fire based on what has happened. As the system has performed the susceptibility testing. So on VITEK 2, those might be like bioart rules that fire and tell you something about the way that something should be reported, or there's an issue here or something like that. The advanced expert system for VITEK 2, and I'm sure I'm just going to speak to that because I'm not as familiar with other products out there. But this is I'm sure there's similar things out there that work with a similar functionality, but the advanced expert system is pretty cool in that it's got this background information of lots and lots of MIC, or minimum inhibitory concentration, distributions of different bug drug combos in the background. And so what it does is it will take the phenotypic susceptibility testing information that you get from running a card on the system, and it will match this information with these rules and then the MIC distributions in the background to essentially predict a resistance mechanism or pattern. And it can give you these different options, like, it looks like this pattern versus this pattern because of these reasons. So that's a really neat way to detect these various resistance patterns, which is really, really challenging for labs, right? Because there are so many different mechanisms out there. Organisms can harbor multiple mechanisms at the same time, which really makes anything we have available to us a little more challenging, because it's kind of hard to detect what's going on when there's multiple mechanisms present. But that said, if you've ever printed off a report off of your automated susceptibility test system and you've looked at the MIC and the interp and then tried to guess what the resistance mechanism is, this is called interpretive reporting. And there's a lot of people out there that do that. This became like a fun game on social media for a while, where people would post their MIC distributions from an isolate and say, "What do you guys think this is?" That's essentially what the advanced expert system is doing. So um, it's a cool way for these modern technologies to be paired with software that can integrate algorithms that help support human decision making, right? So instead of a human printing off a report, comparing MICs and interps manually all the time and trying to say, "Hey, ooh, this looks like it's got this type of resistance mechanism," this is what the system is doing for you. So that's essentially what those are offering.
Yeah, and for those in the audience, with this systems, for example, you see it tells you like the flags and what is what's happening like with the pattern. Sometimes, for example, with when you have like a staff, for example, and your vector gives you like adaptomycin greater than 1. So since with the MIC, it's the susceptible is up to 1, and then it tells you, okay, please confirm this testing, and you get all these rules when you're getting like an inducible clindamycin resistance. If it changes the interpretation of your clindamycin when your erythromycin is resistant, and you have that, it flags it as that ICR positive. So those are some examples, so you can have like a visual thing as you're listening. Okay.
I would just add that the utility of this kind of software really depends too on the information that's in the background, right? So that is the fancier we get with our technologies, the more we're going to have to probably update the background information on these mechanisms and phenotypes and everything in real time. So that's just something to think about as we move forward into the future of AST. It's not just about the really fast and novel technology. It's also considering the background information that's being used to maybe anticipate some of these resistance patterns. And so really important to have a very up-to-date, thorough database in the background if that's what the system is doing.
Perfect. Yes. And and when it comes to my next question with the updates, and for the audience, keep in mind, this is a very lengthy topic, so we can do many episodes about this, and I invite you to check out an episode that we did about breakpoints, where actually, where Andrea here was the guest as well. And as you know, we do the AMR series, which I invite you to go back. We did an introduction when we started with an overview, as she pointed out early on. So definitely check those. So we'll be touching on some of this, but keep in mind that there are many episodes where we do a deeper dive. So we know that there's a challenge with keeping up with breakpoints, right? With the updates, and there have been many things. We still think about the College of American Pathologists, and so why is keeping up with breakpoint updates so important for patient care and antimicrobial stewardship?
This is a really important point, and a simple answer to this is simply stated, if we are not using updated breakpoints, we aren't giving the best information. And in fact, we could be causing harm, certainly not intentionally, but certainly could cause harm to a patient if we're not using up-to-date interpretive criteria. Just think of breakpoints as a translator. It's like trying to have a conversation with someone if your translator's broken. What messages are gonna get lost? What's gonna fall through the cracks? How will the person receiving the message then act based off of the, messy information that you gave them? So it's really important for us to be as up to date as possible. There are some really great articles out there by doctors Trish Sumner and Carol Roche that highlight the reasons why this can be dangerous, why CAP, or the College of American Pathologists, really moved forward in requiring breakpoint updates, every 3 years, or an inspection related to that. Um, it's just really best patient care if we are keeping them as up to date as possible. And I understand that for some laboratories, this seems like a big lift, can be a bit challenging depending on resources available to you, especially staffing. But it is probably one of the more important things we can be doing in terms of making sure we're giving the best patient care possible.
Okay, that was sums up what I was gonna ask, and so it's definitely very very important, and of course anything else that you can say about um when your breakpoints are updated quickly enough, the risk for lapse in patients. Anything else that you can add to that?
Quickly enough is sort of challenging because it's like there's always kind of a lag, right? Like if a breakpoint gets updated, there's a lag in that process because data have to be reviewed and decisions have to be made about why a breakpoint needs to be updated. And then whether or not there's agreement on that breakpoint, and then whether or not a manufacturer can get that cleared on their system. Like there's always a bit of a lag. And so it's just important to note, in that interim lag period, there's probably nothing happening that's like very disastrous, right? Like it's not gonna hurt anyone immediately, but it is important to try to move as quickly as possible because in some cases, like we saw with like carbapenems, for example, using outdated breakpoints for those has serious, serious consequences. And the less you can use them when they're inappropriate, the better. Um, so I think, if it depends where the lag is as well, if there's a period of time where regulatory agencies and manufacturers are delaying, the lab will certainly feel this. If there's a delay between agreement between a standard setting organization and FDA, manufacturers certainly feel this. So it just depends where the lag is in the process. And again, there's that earlier episode that you and I did together on your it's an earlier Let's Talk Micro podcast episode. We dive really deeply into that process around how that works, how a breakpoint gets changed and why, and then how that happens also at FDA between organizations like CLSI and FDA, what agreement looks like, how that impacts manufacturers, and then how that impacts laboratories. So there's lots of opportunities for some delay in the process, but just overall, I would say all of us working hard to try to get things updated as quickly as possible is ideal. There's, of course, limitations that happen for every individual in that pathway, but it's worth going as efficiently as we can.
Yeah, which brings the next question, and and as you said, we're referring the listeners to the other episode where you can listen to a little bit more in detail and things like that. So maybe we can touch on this a little bit. But when it comes to to the FDA's current breakpoint recognition process, how does that work in practice, and where are there any challenges in that process that maybe you can think of, or
Yeah, I'll start by saying this whole regulatory environment in the US for susceptibility testing is kind of difficult to wrap your head around. It's pretty complex. There's a lot of moving parts and it's pretty challenging to understand. But if I try to break it down simply, I would just first start by saying, we need regulatory oversight for our products. Like we need regulatory oversight for health and safety, especially when it comes to medicine. We want to know that the things we're doing and the tests we're using are safe and efficacious and good for people, right? So, FDA has, for a long time had resources and skills to make informed decisions about data supporting a breakpoint update. And so the decisions they're making are informed by things they feel are appropriate for making that decision. Um, where things get a bit challenging is where an organization like CLSI, for example, we'll spend the better part of a year looking at data on breakpoints and bug drug combos and susceptibility testing methodologies and make recommendations about breakpoint updates in general. And they will share that with the FDA, and the FDA can either choose to adopt that CLSI change or not. And they all have their own reasons for why they might do this or not. But where the challenge comes in is if FDA and CLSI do not agree on this breakpoint change, things get a little tricky. Manufacturers of devices can really only get cleared for the breakpoints that are recognized by the FDA. And so I think what ends up happening is our clinical community tends to really prefer to use CLSI breakpoints. They really lean heavily on CLSI breakpoints. And if there's a mismatch, there's some frustration around what will be used. Clinicians and laboratorians might want to use CLSI breakpoints on their system, but that hasn't been cleared because FDA and CLSI don't agree. This is becoming less and less of a problem, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this is where we get some gaps and where things can be challenging. It's not something you cannot work through. Um, Laboratories just then are responsible for deciding, if they want to use a breakpoint that's not cleared on their system. It might end up being like an off-label validation or more work in terms of getting a validation done that demonstrates performance is acceptable in their hands. So it just ends up becoming a bit more complex and can lead to delays depending on how things land, if there's agreement between breakpoints or not.
Okay, yeah. And this is actually, a question that since you're more involved with these things, and sometimes some of us in the lab might not be too familiar with, or maybe might not hear of, but when it comes to like the regulatory side, what is the 21st Century Cures Act? Let's start with that. And then also, and how does that change the way breakpoints are updated and implemented in AST systems?
So I'm learning something new about all this every day, I swear it. But I find this very interesting. So the 21st Century Cures Act was an act that was put in place in 2016, and the intent of that was to accelerate medical product development and innovation, to try to think about the barriers that were limiting innovation in some way, right? And there's a provision within that act that explicitly focuses on how FDA handles AST breakpoints. And so this is where the STIC website came from. If anybody's familiar with that, I think by this point, people are probably really familiar with the susceptibility test interpretive criteria, or STIC website on the FDA's larger website. This is where you have to go a lot to see, does FDA recognize the CLSI breakpoint? Do they have their own? So we've been referring to this website a lot as a larger community. We've been working on getting breakpoints updated. Um, this was really the point of this was to allow for publicly accessible information that showed whether a new or revised breakpoint was approved or available according to FDA, and improve the speed of dissemination of that information. And so creating this website was allowing more visibility to those and more maybe expeditious updating of breakpoints and posting them on this site. So that whole STIC website really came from the 21st Century Cures Act. So overall, it was a really big move forward. It also, I think, opened up the door quite a bit to FDA recognizing CLSI breakpoints in general. Like, they don't always disagree. And in fact, they rarely don't adopt a CLSI breakpoint. And so I think, don't quote me on this, but I'm not sure if before the Cures Act, there was no, adopting those and sharing them. I think it was just FDA breakpoints and CLSI breakpoints. And this was more of a merging and public sharing of this agreement, and posting of what breakpoints are accepted and recognized by FDA publicly.
So, despite the intent of this, there's still delays as we have talked about. What are some of the key bottlenecks that you're seeing today when it comes to this?
So we talked about the challenges that pop up when there's a disagreement between breakpoints and groups, right? I will say that as of quite recently, the FDA STIC site has been showing recognition of like most CLSI breakpoints. So this has been an amazing step. Like, I don't think anyone can overemphasize how great that is and how important that is to helping things move a little more fluidly. There's a really great paper by Trish Simner and Romney Humphreys in Journal of Clinical Microbiology that was published fairly recently that talks about this, if you want to read a little bit more about that and why this is so beneficial. But that's been really, really great. Where I still am seeing, I think, challenges is that in general, the process for getting things updated on an automated system is not easy. I think sometimes we think it's a flip of a switch and we get an updated breakpoint on your automated system and you can just go live with it tomorrow. Sometimes, and there's a lot of factors that go into this, but sometimes getting a new breakpoint cleared will take a whole, maybe another review or resubmission process, maybe more organism testing. Going through that in general is a lengthy process involving many months. And so even if CLSI updates a breakpoint, FDA accepts it, and a manufacturer starts the next day on getting this updated on the system, it's still going to take, many months potentially for this to get updated. Another important thing to remember is that if this update process is happening at the manufacturer level through research and development or clinical affairs, they're balancing a ton of competing priorities at the same time. So, especially if you've got a large organization that's trying to do a lot of innovative things and has a lot of data submissions going at the same time, um, trying to decide where this priority falls can sometimes lead to maybe a bottleneck or a challenge depending on what else is being prioritized and going on. Not to say it's not important, of course, but there are a lot of different things going on at any given time, and so that prioritization can be, a challenge or can lead to an update maybe taking a little longer. I think thinking about how it gets communicated. So if a manufacturer does get an update cleared on their system, how does that get communicated to the user of the product? And then how do they get it updated in their system? So if they're not getting like a software update, is this something they manually have to put into their system? And if they do that, do they need to do some sort of verification to back that up? Do they have the staff for that? Does that take time? So there's lots of little points, I think, where things get a little bit backed up. I am hearing a lot from colleagues, a lot of staffing challenges in the laboratory, a lot of just logistical challenges around getting what may have otherwise felt like a simple verification done might feel a little more laborious these days. So that also, I think, has been a bit of a challenge for folks.
Okay, so and I think you covered most of this, but just to kind of bring it all up and to one place, and so what's the manufacturer's role in aligning with the new CLSI breakpoints under the current framework?
I think, like I said, there's balancing priorities, figuring out what can be done and when. But I think it's important for all manufacturers to really consider communication in this process, right? So, like I said, sometimes there are things that can be done right away. Sometimes there's regulatory challenges, and whether or not a manufacturer can move forward with an update immediately or not, it depends on what's going on with the manufacturer. But I think communicating what's coming, a timeline for these things, if that's possible, I think is really helpful for users of susceptibility test systems so that they can plan validations, verifications, communication to their ID colleagues that are expecting these AST results. And the other thing I would probably add is that manufacturers are often they have clinical representation from within the company at things like CLSI meetings or engagement with FDA colleagues or other regulatory bodies to understand the landscape and to know how this model works and when there's opportunity to get updated as soon as possible. And I think a lot of manufacturers are doing that quite well. It's just navigating the landscape, has its challenges.
One thing, and then as we talk about breakpoints, and I do remember when I touched on when the CAP did that survey and then improving breakpoints, and we talk about the challenges. And I remember we do see professional organizations, sometimes coming together, and I remember that they came together with like a tool and like a breakpoint tool implementation kit, and that was a collaboration between many organizations, and so we know there's that teamwork. They're coming together. So when it comes to right to maybe influence clear regulatory pathways and improve breakpoint adaptation, do you know of any professional organizations that are working on this?
I probably will fail to mention some that are doing great work. I'll just list a few off the top of my head that you've already mentioned. I think for folks that are looking for great resources or support or advocacy, American Society for Microbiology or ASM has done a ton of work from the advocacy perspective. They've been on the Hill a lot, they've been writing letters, they've been doing all sorts of things to help support laboratories in the AST breakpoint, testing arena. Infectious Disease Society of America has also done great work in this space from the ID clinician perspective, just around some. In addition to other advocacy efforts, there's information that they've provided online that's been helpful for folks understanding how breakpoints happen and breakpoint changes happen and what laboratories are having to do to get this done. Sometimes I think our clinician partners aren't always as clear on what it involves in the laboratory and what this might mean for the drug results, bug drug combo results they're seeing in a patient's chart or the EHR or what have you. Also, a CAP, of course, CAP, changing their checklist requirement and moving towards this regulatory breakpoint update process, I think was a little scary for people, but this is what has pushed things in the direction of getting everybody updated, getting everybody in the right direction, laboratories, manufacturers alike, right? It has had all of us talking about this more. It's put a big light on the problems and the successes. Organizations like CDC, providing an organism bank for people to use if they are doing, updates and validations and things like that. Manufacturer partners, I know, offering a lot of education and support and things like that. So lots of groups out there doing great work to help people get through this.
And when it comes to the manufacturers and and these regulatory hurdles, what can they do, and maybe if there are any examples of strategies or collaborations that you can share.
Sure. I'll speak from my personal experience alone. I don't want to speak also for R&D or clinical affairs. I'm not in that unit, but I can speak to what I see from the outside and collaborating with them. And I will say, research and development and clinical affairs work really hard to understand the landscape and changes and address these things as soon as it is feasibly possible to do so, right? Again, sometimes when it comes to AST, breakpoint changes, this could be like a resubmission, it could be more data. And we talked about the balancing of priorities and how challenging that might be. Um, I think, it could also be challenging for manufacturers that are global. If you're a global company, you're representing the whole world. And the way AST devices are cleared and breakpoints are updated and all that, it does not look the same in every country. Not every country goes through FDA. Not every country uses the same regulatory pathways or has the same, expectations for those types of things. And so the way breakpoints, you've got UCAST in a lot of the world, and UCAS breakpoints may not be the same as CLSI, may not be the same as FDA, and what gets used at different locations around the world really impacts how this looks. Are they, can they use ISO specifications to get something cleared is going to change the way things get rolled out. So I think, there's a lot of collaboration that happens. I think success stories that I've seen from my end is I cannot compliment enough the medical colleagues um, within my own organization that have dedicated hours and hours and years and months and seconds and days to spending time with people that are using our devices and doing either medical education or data review or real-time support, especially for sites that do not have the infrastructure of a PhD clinical microbiology director and are looking for help and maybe don't have the resources available to them to do a really large validation or to even navigate this, understanding this regulatory environment. Sometimes the manufacturer is the best help they have. And so I think it's been really, really important for us to leverage our, this amazing team of clinical microbiologists and ID pharmacists and using their knowledge and their skills to help people figure out how to navigate this from a fair and balanced way that often has nothing to do with a product and more to do with understanding, everything we just talked about, when breakpoints are agreed upon and when they're published and what it takes to get something cleared. And then more specifically, manufacturers really working with customers that are using their products on what has been cleared, what has not been cleared, what are the limitations, what does that mean, how do you address these? This has all been really, really important. And I think there's also, we have to give a nod to within organizations, ours especially, I've noticed some great government affairs advocacy group efforts. So, there's lots of advocacy to be done as well in terms of, how can we help support clinical laboratories using automated susceptibility test devices, get where they need to be for the best patient care. And then I know I've said it already, but a ton of communication, right? We have these amazing groups within the organization that can help, but we all have to communicate. We have to communicate really, really well with the people using the system regarding any changes or any education that's needed. We've got people out in the field. You've got like uh, field application specialists and technical support colleagues that are constantly offering all sorts of support and resources to get through things like breakpoint updates. So, huge, multifaceted effort, never easy, always complicated, but certainly worth the effort.
Okay, yeah, I think that kind of answers the question about the labs, because they're the customers, right? And so definitely communication, and it can definitely sometimes seem daunting and seem, but that's something that I have reemphasized here. There's also a lot of people out there that are willing to talk to you. There's many key opinion leaders and people in the microbiology community that they're just one email away, and they're happy to guide you in the right direction even if you don't know what to do. So you are not alone in my field. You're in that lab, and you said sometimes you talk about the lack of sometimes having a PhD or someone on site, but there's plenty of good people out there that just want to help you. So keep that in mind. Just one email away.
Exactly, and there's a ton I would just comment too, there's a ton of resources out there right now to help people through breakpoint updates. Luis, you mentioned, CLSI, CAP, CDC work together to create an implementation tool, breakpoint implementation tool. I know some manufacturers have this available. We certainly, worked on one a few years ago to kinda help think through, like, what do we have available for our system, and what does that look like in terms of breakpoint changes. There are organism banks, and then there's folks working at centers that have been doing this for a while or are very well versed in breakpoint updates that could help you. There's listservs you can get on through ASM or other organizations where you can talk to other clinical laboratorians that maybe have done this before. So it's just a great community of people out there that could help, and lots of resources have been made freely, publicly available to help people get through this.
Yeah, so true. I once was invited to be a guest on another podcast episode, and it was about that, about the breakpoints updates, and prepare from that. You start doing searches, and I found like so many videos from CAP and other organizations doing like tutorials and pointing things out, doing presentations, webinars. So definitely true, a lot of resources. So so now that we have talked about breakpoints and regulations and maybe looking ahead, what kind of regulatory or policy shifts will help streamline breakpoint harmonization moving forward?
I think, I'm not probably well versed enough in policy more broadly to say what needs to come next. But I would say what I've seen that has been so helpful is what I mentioned earlier, where we've seen a lot more adoption of CLSI breakpoints on the FDA stick site. That has been so helpful. I actually, these days, am feeling a little less concerned with breakpoints. I think breakpoints are, a really big challenge for a while. Lots of people were behind. The CAP checklist requirement really put a fire under everyone in a good way, and I think for a while there, it felt a little frantic, and we were talking about it constantly, but I would say I feel that a lot of people are in the flow now. We've got a flow going for breakpoints. We've got a plan. Um, Manufacturers working harder to get stuff updated or continuing to work as hard as they were if they already were. Laboratories more well-versed in this, and so I think breakpoints are actually starting to go a little more swimmingly. I think I'm actually seeing a lot of challenges around other regulatory components of AST that maybe weren't as in our face before, but now that we've been, really working through these, regulatory processes and understanding them better, I think what I'm seeing is, for example, back in the day, if you will, manufacturers could submit data on broader organism categories. So something like clinically significant gram-negative bacilli. And that's no longer allowed. And so if you are submitting data on a certain organism group, it's not going to really be this broad category anymore. You might be getting claims for specific genus and species drug combinations, which might end up in a limitations on organisms you were reporting before. And a lot of this has to do with this rule that the organisms that get clearance or bug drug combos that get clearance on devices have to be in line with the original drug package insert that's available through the FDA. And some of these drugs are, maybe older, or maybe there's not that many organisms listed from the clinical trial of the drug. And so that could limit what the device is able or cleared to report on or release. This is really, really complex. And so I'm not going to get in the weeds on this. But I think what I'm seeing is a lot of challenges around that. Laboratories maybe um, were using an older version of a card or panel that was cleared more broadly. And then when that got updated, a lot of that broad, claim fell away. And so now laboratories are, maybe stuck with, okay, I've got one genus and species here. I can report this drug result out on. What about all the others? Do they have to do a validation to be able to use that? What does that look like for them? And so I think what I've been hearing from clinical colleagues a little more often these days is fewer challenges around breakpoints and more challenges around these limitations, just being a little more limiting on the organism group that is claimed for some devices. And so I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. I know that there are conversations around how that could be addressed at a level that is not my own, and within FDA, et cetera. And I know that's something that folks are aware of, but that's been an interesting challenge that I think I wasn't as aware of until a little more recently. And seeing labs try to bring in newer AST technologies or updates of existing technologies and losing some of these claims or indications for use, and then figuring out how they could get that back has been interesting, especially if clinicians are used to seeing reports for certain bug drug combos and then all of a sudden they're not getting those anymore. It leads to some interesting clinical conversations between the lab and the providers. So I think that's, I don't know that that answers the question of what policy shifts would help streamline breakpoints, but it's a regulatory challenge I think I'm seeing more and more of when we're working in AST, and something I think would be really helpful if we as a whole community could address.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned broader, keeping to mind that even sometimes when you look at some groups or organisms, like for example, you have this whole category of your like non-enterobacteriales that encompasses all this. So we focus on, okay, you have your enterobacteriales, then you have these other organisms that right, they're very multi-drug resistance, and we're very familiar with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Cyanobacteria baumannii, Stenotrophomonas, so on. And then you have this whole broad category that encompasses all of them. It's like not even the other Pseudomonas as well. So it's just, I don't know, it's very interesting. Okay, by now, if there's anything that you want to add with this, we have definitely emphasized, right, the importance of communication, and when it comes to meetings and collaboration and things like that, and anything else that you can add to that when it comes to shaping the future of AST regulations.
Yeah, I just think that getting everyone in the room is always a good idea. It might get a little heated, but it's a great idea. And I mean, manufacturers, regulatory agencies, standard setting organizations, clinical champions, laboratorians, et cetera. All of these people in the same room, because what I've found over the years working in this space is the larger we, make a lot of assumptions about each other, which may or may not be true. And so I think it's really, really helpful to have these discussions. I often find that we underestimate the amount of work it takes laboratories to get these things up to date. We underestimate the staffing challenges that are happening in clinical laboratories right now, and also the availability of expertise that it requires to be able to do this, especially if, we haven't had as many medical laboratory scientists trained specifically in AST that have done large validations leading a laboratory. That's maybe not as, it doesn't look the same as it did 20 years ago, or what have you. I think there's always an assumption that manufacturers aren't trying hard enough or moving fast enough. And I continue to learn every day the intricacies of what it takes to get things submitted, cleared, moved through a pipeline. Like, it's crazy. There's a ton that goes into that. Um, I think the assumptions about regulatory agencies and what their rule setting is based on and why they're making the decisions they're making are, we make a lot of assumptions about that. So it's always very valuable to have all of these groups in one room talking about these things as often as possible. Um, I think that having regulatory agencies understand how some of the rules that are set impact the amount of off-label testing laboratories might end up having to do if they're trying to validate a bunch of things that are outside of what's cleared. Is that best practice? Is that what does that look like for a laboratory? I think for laboratories to understand why regulatory agencies make the decisions they do and how that's probably based in what's best for patient care and safety. So I just think, you know what I mean? It's just really good for everybody to come together and talk about it so we can try to address these things a little more holistically because it's extremely complex.
Yeah, definitely having a better understanding. And as you said, sometimes, people have assumptions and you get frustration. And sometimes all you're seeing, maybe from the lab point of view, is, oh, we're getting more work now, or we're doing this, or now we have to do this test when we get this organism and this, and that. And you couple that right with the regular challenges of, as you mentioned, sometimes, staffing and training, and, you still have to, test your patients and things like that. So it's not like you can just close the lab, train, get updated, and then move on, right? Just so it's constantly moving. So there are many challenges. And we have talked about this, so this is kind of just to like bring it home, and we have pointed to the resources and things like that. But at the end, and maybe you're still listening to this and you're saying, okay, well, I hear you. I'm going to listen all the other Let's Talk Micro episodes and get my hands on all the other information. But I'm still feeling frustrated, as a manager or as a microbiologist with these delays. If you have one message to tell them, what would it be?
It'll be a long message, probably. I have lots of things to say, but I would just say I empathize. I hear you. Hang in there. A lot of us truly do empathize, and are working hard to try to support and address this. I think that I promise you, and I say navigating this is not easy for anyone. Anyone. So, if you feel like this is just so complicated, I think 99% of people working in this space would tell you they feel it's the same. So you're not alone there. But patient care should be at the heart of everything we're doing. Manufacturers, regulatory, standard setting organizations, laboratorians, truly, that is why we are doing what we're doing. And so we should be striving for excellence always. And sometimes that means hard work that feels really taxing. Um, Scientific organizations, manufacturers, resources available all over the web can help get you through this. But it sometimes will feel tough. And I think what contributes a bit to this is we're in this weird place right now, right? Where the microbiology lab has changed so much very quickly over the last, gosh, even just 20 years, where when we used to take a lot more time to slowly work through a test or slowly work through a process in the lab, we are in the era of rapid diagnostic testing, direct from sample, answers as fast as we can, stewardship. You look at the outcomes we measure when we try to see if a test is really helping people, and we're looking at things like how long did it take for them to get the right antibiotic? How long were they in the hospital? How can we do everything faster? And so, doing a process like a breakpoint validation or a validation for things that are not claimed, but you have good data for and your clinicians want feels like this huge, it probably feels like a PhD project in the middle of your super busy workday. Like, when are you going to put down what you're doing, to take all this time to figure out these crazy logistics around getting your AST breakpoints updated and all the regulatory challenges associated with that. So I get it. I think a lot of people also get it. And just lean into the resources that you have. I've said this on many episodes before, but I highly recommend, reaching out to colleagues in the field, to the free resources available through organizations like ASM, CAP, CLSI. The tools that they offer are incredibly helpful. And then your manufacturer, find your people at your manufacturer. There are medical and scientific affairs professionals that might be able to answer questions specifically around um, these breakpoints if they're not clear cut and they're more complex, your field application specialists, your technical support teams. So this is, all very helpful. And it's also how manufacturers understand what the pain points are out there. We can't do better if we don't know what's going on. We can't address problems if we're not aware. So it's always really helpful to have that communication as well.
Okay, well, as the episode is coming to an end, and that sounded like a great, closing question type of deal. But I still, if there's anything else that you want to tell the audience, do you have anything?
I would just say what you always say and thank them so much for their incredible work out there. What they do every day is so important. And I know I'm grateful. I am a patient as well. And I am grateful for everyone out there thinking hard about clinical microbiology and how to do it really, really well. So thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. Like I said, continue bringing that passion to what you do. You're important. You do such great work. So once again, as always, Andrea, it's always great chatting with you. So thank you for taking the time to be in Let's Talk Micro.
My pleasure.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, it is such a pleasure having Andrea on the podcast, and I hope that you enjoyed this information, right? Learning about AST, breakpoints, all the challenges. And as I like to say, all in all, such a great episode. Once again, thank you to bioMérieux, our sponsor, a global innovator in infectious disease diagnostics. Thank you for the opportunity, bioMérieux. As always, you can find Let's Talk Micro on all social platforms: Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky Social as Let's Talk Micro, X as Let's Talk Micro 1, LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. There's the website, letstalkmicro.com, which I invite you to check out and subscribe to us so you can get updates. And, there's study resources. You can subscribe and get updates about episodes. So I invite you to check it out. And if you want to leave any feedback, you can do so via the website and via an email, letstalkmicro@outlook.com. Any feedback, any suggestions, they are always welcome and appreciated. And as always, you can find Let's Talk Micro on all podcast platforms, right? Like Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Goodpods. So please subscribe, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please go ahead and leave a review. Okay, and if you're listening and you want to support the podcast, you can do so via a Venmo link or via Buy Me a Coffee, KOFI, both links available on the show notes. And if you're looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. And these are some great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. And of course, as you know, the Let's Talk Micro podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology. To learn more about microbes, visit asm.org. And that, my dear audience, is the end of this episode. Welcome to Season 5, first episode. As I said before, it is so great to be here with you, doing another season. Thank you for the support. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you. I really do. So, and stay tuned. As I said, this episodes with bioMérieux, they are being released like every 4, 5, 6 weeks. So stay tuned on social media, on my post, and here on Let's Talk Micro. But please, of course, stay tuned. Great content coming your way. So please, continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such great work. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.